action. Just to confirm that the interpretation is working, because in your case is English interpretation. Thank you so much for confirming that. So we're all good, we're all set and ready to go. We have interpretation in place. I also recommend, please, that we take turns to speak. We also try to speak as slowly as possible in order to facilitate the job of the interpreters. If you have any technical issues throughout the session, I would like to ask you to please directly contact Monica Mora, who's backstage here looking at all details for today's session. And she will additionally drop her email address just in case you are sent out of the Zoom session, you have some connectivity issues. We'd rather not use the group chat in order not to be disruptive. Your microphones will be muted throughout the session. This will actually help us listen better. Now, if throughout the session you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the general chat box, or you can also virtually use one of your reactions and raise your hand. So those of you who have your cameras on and want to raise your hands and show and display that hand up, you can do so too. Um, Lastly, we need to remind you that we have a Drive folder where you can have access to all presentations, recordings, both of the former session and also this one. My colleague Monica is sharing that link also in the chat box. So I think we have a group of 23 participants. Again, it's a pleasure to see that you've been able to join today. We would really um, love to have a round of introductions, but that will really take up a lot of time from our session. So I invite you to rename yourselves. You have the options. If you click on the participants list, you find your name, you click on more, and you can rename yourselves. And you can add there, for example, in my case, it's Cassandra Llosa, UNDP, and Esteban Delgado, for example, PNUD in Spanish, that is UNDP in Spanish. So we have CONAF also, so we can learn which institutions you're joining and representing. So that's about everything in terms of logistical aspects. Before we delve directly into our agenda today, I also wanted to mention that this project has been organized, even this round of consultation, been also co-organized with the UNDP Chile, the Ministry of the Environment, and CONAF. So we thank them for joining the session today. So before we start, we thought we could actually have a group picture just as if we were in an in-person session. So if we can turn on our cameras just for a few minutes for the group picture in the era of virtual uh, meetings, this will be our record of the meeting. So let us all smile. All set, all good. Thank you. So we've taken that picture. Thank you so much, Moni. Are we ready? Thank you. Excellent. Perfect. Thank you for that. Very well. So before we start with the content of the session, I would like to give the floor to Daniel Alvarez Latorre, Head of the Department of Policies and Planning of Biodiversity from the Ministry of the Environment of Chile. Daniel, thank you so much for being here today and for providing support since the inception of this project. Take it away. Thank you so much, Cassandra. Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to be once again with all of you. Uh, this is a second round of consultation of our project Restoring Hope. And today's session will be allowing us to move forward along this thematic area, which is of utmost interest for all of our institutions. We are working in the restoration of landscapes. We are also deploying other policies that are related to these topics, such as the National Strategy on Biodiversity, the National Strategy on Climate Change, with clear restoration objectives and goals. So having the support from all of you for this project and the top quality and the caliber of the products that you are delivering is something very satisfactory. Your engagement and participation is also necessary to continue validating this process and also arrive at results and outcomes that we may use in our public policies. It is our interest that this be so. So thank you once again for your active and meaningful engagement, and let us all have a very fruitful session. Thank you so much also to the UN PD local, national, and international teams. Thank you, Danielle, for your kind words and opening remarks, and thank you to the Ministry of the Environment for working here on this project since its inception, sharing your know-how and guidance also around the unblocking of the use of geospatial data for this prioritization exercise of territories and lands for restoration. To our participants, once again, mentioned, please do not hesitate to rename yourselves, or if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat box, so that we can know who are present. So with that, we're going to look at the goals for this second session after having finished our first round of consultations in the 5 countries where we are deploying this project, Restoring Hope. We've started then this second session. We started once again with Chile. Chile is again the first country where we started the second round of consultations. Hopefully this will be useful for the results of the project to have a positive impact on national policies that Chile has with regards to restoration. I'm now going to ask my colleague Monica for her to share once again the agenda that you have in your inboxes, but just to have the latest version up on the screen. So just as a reminder, the project's goals are identifying and prioritizing the areas where political responsible parties may adopt measures of restoration to meet national commitments in matters of biodiversity and soil degradation. The second goal is to look into the strategic priorities in the country in aspects of restoration. Thirdly, determine this global and national data clusters necessary to conduct this analysis. And lastly, apply the principles of systematic planning of conservation to meet this vision with a scientific rigor. So since this session is online and we've been able to really pack time for this to be quite active and interactive as well, and also for it not to take up a lot of time from your agendas, we know that it's quite tight and ambitious, but this project has had then 2 rounds of consultation. The first session was held in the month of September, specifically on September the 7th, and if for any reason you were not able to attend that session, it is a great use if you may access the report of this first workshop. My colleague Monica is also sharing with you the link to the report. Thank you so much, Alberto Alani, National Consultant in Geospatial Data, who's focused on the drafting of the report. And today we're having the second round of consultation. This exercise of discussion started off in September. In this first session back in September, we focused on introducing the vision of the project along with the first version of the restoration dossier for Chile, Some time was spent presenting the data clusters used for the analysis that served in turn to create the first iterations of the degradation map and also the map for prioritization of restoration. So the idea was to gather your feedback that started off with that session and has continued throughout several weeks on a one-to-one work with the different institutions that are with us today in order to fine-tune that analysis, identify some data gaps, improve the data, update them, and with that, we've been able to draft this dossier that we will be presenting today. This is an updated version, updated edition of the restoration dossier for Chile. And as you will be able to see in the presentations that we have prepared for today's session, we will see how these maps have been updated, more specifically that of prioritization of restoration um, through the use of the different data clusters that you have been able to provide since our first consultation round. And at the end of today's session, we will be focusing on an exercise of feedback, both on the dossier and also with regards to the map for prioritizing restoration, so that in the end, we may be sharing in the upcoming weeks a consolidated version of the dossier for Chile. So once again, please remember you have access to all documents in a Drive folder. Francois, I'm not sure if I spelled that correctly. Thank you so much for the information. Thank you, Francois, for your engagement and participation. So this is the agenda for today then. We have also the following presentations. First of all, we will have the updated version of our dossier for restoration in Chile with different colleagues of the team, with a summary of the different sections of the dossier that have been updated by Alberto Analis, the updated version of the degradation map by Scott Atkinson, the data gathered from since the first workshop by Dee Sang and Oscar Venta, and then we will be also differentiating restoration, rehabilitation, and recovery of ecosystems. And that will be in charge of Oscar Venter. And we will be also, by Oscar, having these different ecosystems differentiated. And we will then have the feedback segment, and we will be also devoting some minutes to UN Biodiversity Lab. And some of you may remember, since the mapping of nature for people and the planet under Dee Sang, with some priorities on the aspect of restoration and private work for Chile. So with that, we will be able to kick off our session. But before that, I'd like to thank institutions who make this project possible. Uh, First of all, I'd like to thank the Office of the UNDP Chile, who has been with us and standing by ourselves since the inception of the project. I want to thank the Ministry of the Environment and CONAF, who have also helped and supported through critical feedback and substantial feedback. And lastly, the Secretariat of Convention on Biological Diversity, who are funding this project. And of course, it would not be possible without them. So with that, we're now going to delve into the presentations. They will take around 45 minutes all in all of this second version of our dossier. But before that, we would like to have a very brief survey just to know how many of you have at least been able to look at it very briefly, have downloaded it, have been able to look at that version that was sent to you last week. So we'll see if you have not been able um, to look at it. That still helps to look at the level of depth that we need to give to each of the exercises. So please feel free to pour your answers. I should have at least 12 uh, without counting, of course, those of us who are part of the global team. That's why I'm saying around 12. One more minute. So for the time being, we see that you haven't had the necessary time to review it, but please don't worry because this is why we're having this session, so that we may look at it together, especially as of Alberto's first presentation, who will be mentioning those sections that have been updated. I think that we can close the survey now.
Listo. Entonces, bueno, como recordatorio, este
All
dossier
good. So as a reminder, this dossier has been drafted as of a joint effort between the UNDP, both of the national team and also the global team working together, and the Secretariat on the Convention on Biological Biodiversity in the search of testing. This is, again, a pilot project to test that synergy approach, seeking to document and to record the compilation of exercises when it comes to prioritization land areas for restoration. Aside of this has to be based on an intergovernmental exercise, also based on an international framework. So this dossier seeks to contribute to countries so that they may in turn optimize the targets with regards to restoration policies, and also when it comes to implemented prioritization of areas for restoration, taking into account variables such as biodiversity, climate change, and degradation of soil. And very importantly, the exercise, the activity seeks to trigger dialogue and collaboration among the different key stakeholders of the three different conventions and other stakeholders involved in this work of prioritizing restoration. This may in turn serve as a basis in the different countries, and these may be adjusted, but it can be to update the national plan of restoration or to design it or to have a follow-up mechanism in place. This may change among the 5 different pilot countries. So let us delve directly into the presentation. So first we have the presentation by Alberto Alanis with regards to the update of the dossier for restoration. Alberto, take it away. Thank you so much, Cassandra. So as we share the presentation, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. And the feedback that you provide as a group is indeed fundamental for us to develop this dossier in the most possible smooth way, actually, as of the data that we gather. So what I'll show today is something very brief, because in the presentation of my colleagues will be actually contributing in much more depth what these changes mean. I wanted to share what has been updated since our last session. So next slide, please. So first of all, the dossier is actually consisting of 2 major parts. Number 1 speaks about the framework of governance on a national level, introducing different topics related to funding of restoration, related to management, and the advancement that have taken place at an institutional level. The second part is related to these different layers of information that have allowed a scientific team to develop a proposal for priority areas for conservation under different scenarios. So with regards to the first part, that is management and governance, what we've carried out is a compilation and a thorough compilation around different pieces of information related to restoration in Chile on an institutional scale. First has to do with the governance of restoration of ecosystems that we had actually analyzed as of 2 different approaches within the wildlife areas where you have an institutionality that has been declared, and then without out of these protected wildlife areas. So what we've seen is the projects that have been implemented both within and outside of the protected areas. And the second point, we address the challenges for restoration. This has to do with a national restoration plan of landscape 2021-2030, the national strategy for climate change, and a series of policies that are related to or that tap into ecological restoration at different levels. The next one, please. Sorry, one before. Thank you. So then we move on to the analysis of policies and what we implement, and we analyze each of the policies, existing policies on a national level, and how those policies put forth different goals that are georeferential, so to speak. That is to say, we can take them to a spatial dimension, to a geographic dimension, where we, among others, we find these relevant goals of the geospatial analysis, that these are the goals that Chile has set to different timelines, 2030, 2050, for each of the policies, taking into account financial situation with these restoration goals. That is, what are the funding sources for these type of projects, and what are the goals that at present we have with regards to implementation. Next slide. One of the fields that we did, or the updates with regards to the former version, has to do with the implementation of data on a local level. That is, data that are used in Chile and that are considered official data. One of these significant changes has to do with the classification of ecosystems that we are using. In the former version, we used a classification that was divided Chile into three main areas. That is, ecoregions where we had the desert, Mediterranean, and temperate or moderate. However, to add to the level of detail, we now use the different terrestrial or land ecosystems that have to do with different vegetation and soil for a certain level of analysis that we develop. We also use a different vegetation formations. Next slide, please. Another update that is significant has to do with the change of data related to soil coverage. In the first version, we used the international data that are from the ESA, from the European Union. That is an international map with regards to soil coverage, but basically we introduced the change as of the need to be able to identify soil coverage of high relevance for restoration, because they are related to environmental impact, and that's why we use the land registry and vegetation from CONAF. So this was directly weighed from infrastructure of geospatial data under the Ministry of Agriculture. And this is important because, as opposed to the former version, we can now identify forest plantations and differentiate that. There was a specific restraint or constraint that had the former version of our dossier. Another advancement has to do with the fact that this new version, this last map that you see to your right, was developed not long ago. Actually, it is not included in the PDF version that you have, but we've developed it a short time ago by the scientific team. And you have the international landscape where you prioritize or seek to prioritize 30% of the degraded areas on a national level. And on the other hand, the creation of a scenario on a national level aiming at 4.01%, that is, in a total of 1 million hectares restoration target. Other important points within this update, first of all, with regards to the enhancement of explanation of methods and the achievement or the obtention of the different layers, you'll be able to see in the dossier the type of work that the scientific team conducted to improve and enhance each of these layers, how they are obtained, and what each of these layers represent. That will lead you to the prioritization. The other aspect was that of validating the different updates or to dates of the different layers, for example, indigenous territories on a national level. The third aspect has to do with the main use of local databases, where we implemented the use of data such as ArcLIM or the wetlands inventory that attest to the fact that this analysis that we conducted to be robust, to be a sound database, because these are national Chilean databases. We included new layers in order to represent some ecosystems that were underrepresented in the former version, such as the coastline wetlands. We also improved the description of these layers in the dossier. Lastly, as of all of the information that we were able to gather as of a first consultation, we wanted to improve and enhance each of the points, each of the layers. There was an exchange of information with each of the contact focal points. For example, Daniel Alvarez, who had a first review or revision of the dossier. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alberto, for the excellent presentation. And we have a few minutes for questions, comments. In any case, in our segment for feedback, I think that there will be lots of questions with regards to this new version of the dossier and the map of prioritization of areas for restoration. You can, of course, feel free to raise your hands or just drop the question in the chat box. Just remember that there are other presentations in line in order to dig deeper into this general overview. So we can move
I
forward.
think we can move on. So let's move on with the presentation of Scott Atkinson, who is going to show us an updated version of the degradation map. Scott is based in Australia. He might be sleeping due to different in time zones, but he has shared a video with us. If you have any doubts, the scientific team is here to clear them out. So let's hear the video that is sent by Scott to us.
This is Scott Atkinson, NDP, and this short presentation we're going to go over some of the data layers and the methods that went into defining degradation in Chile, how we have mapped degradation in Chile, and therefore how we define the zone within which restoration is a potential action. We use three data sources. We use a national land cover data set, Trends Earth, which is an online platform developed by Conservation International to align with the UNCCD Sustainable Development Goals on tracking and monitoring land degradation. And finally, we implement as well a more recent version of the Human Footprint Index, which some of you may be familiar with. First of all, we use a national land cover data. It has a resolution of around 25 meters. In other countries, we've been using the ESA World Cover dataset. However, in Chile, particularly because there is a lot of emphasis on forest plantations and mixed forest types that involve a large number of exotic tree species, which are missing in the World Cover datasets. It was proposed that we use a national land cover dataset in place. So we are using that instead here. You can see on the right, there's a very distinct bands within the long geography of Chile. The north is very arid, dry. The south has glaciers and forests. And the middle areas are where there's a lot of plantations and a lot of mix between native species and exotic tree species. We're quite interested in the urban areas and agricultural areas. So these are areas where we're able to identify some sort of conversion from a natural land state to something that's more modified. Obviously, urban areas are extremely modified. The image of Manhattan in New York City, there's very little to nothing remotely natural in the environment. On the right, we see an example of an agricultural area vegetation in Colombia. In this instance, we can see some remaining canopy trees, but the hillsides themselves have largely been cleared with some sort of agricultural coffee. We need good pasture lands from this definition because we do not have local data that have been updated recently on pasture. We are limiting scope of that to identifying agricultural areas. For the Trans Earth dataset, we are using the degradation indicator. So this relates to SDG 15.3.1. In their outputs, they simply define a pixel as either having no change, being an improvement, or being degraded. It's one of those three options. So this is an approach that incorporates several different trends in the performance states and trajectory of primary productivity. So these are the three indicators they use to measure that change in productivity. So if there's a change in performance, change in state, or a negative change in the trajectory of primary productivity, considered to be a degraded pixel. So if any one of those three indicators indicates the pixel has seen a degradation, any level of degradation, the whole thing is classed as degraded. And finally, we footprint index. This is a recent update, most currently for year 2019, at 100 meter resolution globally. For those who aren't familiar with the aggregate of several globally available input codes, other linear infrastructure, access, night lights, and field pressures to create an aggregate score ranging from 0 to 50 globally. Areas typically with a score of under 4 are natural, or at least somewhat of a remaining natural state, whereas human systems are those with scores of 4 or above. Scores of around 30 to 50, we're talking about environments. Areas under 4 are areas that may be animal husbandry practices or grazing, whereas croplands around on the so the human footprint is a little bit different. It's useful to help identify less explicit, more cryptic forms of degradation. For example, if we map the land cover or mapping urban areas, those are very clear forms of degradation. The area has been cleared and converted to urban landscape. We know with other commercial infrastructure, things like roadways, power infrastructure, and human access to resources, we know that there's levels of degradation exist beyond just the linear infrastructure those might. And as I mentioned, typically in the literature, degraded areas are those with values of 4 or more. The areas that indicate human activity beyond that change in the natural state of that area. To take a simpler approach to this, after all, we sum these 3 layers together. So the land cover layers, including urban and agriculture. We add to that changes in productivity. And then we add in the other types of expression. So those are the footprint score. And then we combine all that into our maps of graded areas. And 4 to be our for areas where restoration action is not further prioritization model. That's everything for now. If there are any comments or questions, feel free to email me at scott@undp.org. And we'll see you again soon.
No, agradecemos a Scott.
We thank Scott, who is on the other side of the ocean, for his presentation. In any case, our colleagues from the scientific team. In the event, you may have a question or a comment with regards to Scott's presentation. If there are no questions or comments, we're going to hear Tisan's presentation. At the end, we'll have this feedback session in which you will have the possibility of sharing your comments based on the presentations. So my colleague Tisan is going to present on the group of data, of final data sets to create this map of restoration, and it's going to show you what data sets have been updated thanks to your feedback after the first consultation. Dee, you have the floor.
Thank you, Cassandra. Hi, everyone. I'm Dee. I'm a spatial planning and biodiversity expert with UNDP. It's my pleasure to be here and introduce the data used in the mapping of restoration priority areas in Chile. During the first workshop, we have done a very detailed introduction and discussion of each layer used in this analysis, and we collected your feedback. Today, I won't repeat the same content, but will focus more on reporting the changes and updates we made according to your feedback and suggestions during the first workshop. But we'll start with a recap of the overall data structure in this mapping process. We can broadly break the data group down into 4 groups: the base map, planning features, zones, and optionally the lock-in constraints. Each group has different requirements on the spatial data. Starting with the base map, this is the data that defines the range and scale of our planning area. Here we are doing a national scale map at 250 meters resolution. So we used the official national boundary of Chile as the base map. Then the planning features are the main driven elements of this optimization analysis. These are data layers that can spatially identify restoration needs as well as multiple benefits, including potential benefits for biodiversity, climate change mitigation, and human well-being features such as sustainable water supply and disaster risk reductions. The selection of restoration priority is to maximize the representation of all these benefits, the planning features we selected within a given budget or area target. And if there are important features that we should guarantee their representations in the result map, we can use them as lock-in areas, which is the next data group. Lock-in areas will be fully included in the final result map. And then the last data group is the zone. Zones identify where the restoration action can be implemented within the country. This is the spatial hard constraint for this analysis to select restoration priority areas only within the zones defined. With this data structure in mind, now let's take a look of the overall data used in this analysis. As you can see, most of the data layers are national data. Many layers are from the Ministry of Environment, and the climate risk models are from our clean data. There is one global layer used in the planning features to identify the carbon deficit or potential unrealized carbon. But besides that, The other features are all national provided spatial data. There are two changes on the layer used compared to the first iteration we introduced a month ago. I won't go through the layers one by one as we already did that last time, but I'm gonna ask my colleague Monica to drop a link of an Excel spreadsheet with all the detailed information of this layer used, the description, the preview links, and the data source. So you can explore the spreadsheet by yourself and look for the data information of any layers of your interest. Next, I will highlight the changes made to this data stack after the first consultation. The first change is we added a new planning feature of vulnerability of coastal wetland in Chile. This layer presented the vulnerability of coastal wetland at multiple scales derived from climate change, land use, and land cover changes, and biodiversity status. And the next change is an update of the degraded areas. As mentioned by Scott earlier, we have updated the land cover information with national data from CONAF. This is, in this analysis, the degraded areas is used as a special constraint to identify where the restoration actions could take place. So the result map, the restoration priority, will only select areas within the degraded areas defined. So above is the overview of the data used and the updates we did for data in this analysis. And I'm happy to take any questions and comments. Thank you. Over to you, Cassandra.
Muchísimas gracias, Dee. Entonces,
Thank you, Dee. Effectively, if you have any question, comment regarding the information shared by Dee, and I also would like to harness this opportunity to thank the colleagues and national experts who have joined us and have provided support to us in order to guarantee access to this updated data since the first consultation. Daniel, you have the floor. Thank you, Cassandra. Yeah, I wanted to ask concerning the space that is called degraded areas. If you can explain a bit further in detail, Dee, how do you get to that zone? I was following the explanation given by Scott, but if you can go deeper into that, how can you get to that zone? I mean, in the analysis.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So if you see the map on my slides here, the degraded areas is mapped with three components. First is the national land cover changes, actually. We used the categories of agriculture land and urban areas as the input information to indicate land conversion. So these areas are mainly area used to be natural state, but then with human modification, they have been through land conversion. And there is changes on its natural state. And this is the first input for identify restoration area. The second layer of the input elements is the degraded areas according to the UNCCD approach. There they have used three levels of information. First is the degradation of land productivity. and then the degradation of soil carbon or soil organic carbon, as well as land conversions. We have brought the degraded areas defined with UNCCD approach to this layer as the second element for this map. And the third element that we added as an additional information based on the UNCCD approach is that we also considered areas that may undergone mild or human modification stress. Those could be areas that not fully converted, but being under the human modification and stress. And this area is identified through the human footprint index. We used a threshold of 3 of the human footprint index to capture areas that could be going through human modification stress, low density housing or other forms of infrastructure building. So this could be a complement information to capture the light land degradation, and overall they combine together as the degraded area. I hope that answers your question.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank
Dee.
you, Dee. Daniel has said yes. And Esteban, the floor is yours. Thank you, Cassandra. In the same line of the question posed by Daniel, if degradation has been defined based on the reduction of productivity and the changes associated to the original status of the surface of the land surface coverage. In Chile, we have a broad percentage of a territory that is semi-arid or arid in its natural condition. So in those spaces, there are several changes, or there is an important percentage of this surface which transformation is not associated to a loss of vegetation loss or carbon loss associated to agricultural use. In other words, the productive use does not necessarily degrade the surface in terms of carbon or vegetation mass. Vegetation mass is added instead. So how these models encompass these changes that somehow is an opposed direction to the direction that is taken into account as an indicator of degradation based on this model that has been described. I'm not sure if my question is clear. So there is a change that not only occurs in terms of loss of productivity or carbon, there is a change that occurs in the opposite direction, which is an increase of the carbon, an increase in productivity, an increase of the land coverage. Thank you, Esteban. Dee, you have the floor once again.
I would also like to invite Oscar to jump in. I think from my point of view, do you have the data? Sorry about my data. Do you have the data that could identify those type of degradation that present as an increase in the soil carbon? And we can compare that information with the area captured in this degraded area, see if we have considered or involved these area already. And Oscar, feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Dee. That's That's a great suggestion to bring in national data. Chile has a lot of really good national data, and we've seen how it's really driven the analysis so far. So Esteban, if you know national data, that would be great. I'll comment from a general methodology perspective. The point you raise, Esteban, is very true, and one that we've acknowledged early on. That in some cases you might actually pick up increases in productivity through a process of degradation. So degradation, or an example that you're giving is conversion to an agricultural system, can actually increase the soil carbon and the productivity of an arid landscape. And I saw a question come up in the chat just to address that. We're measuring, or the Trends Earth data using the UNCCD approach to degradation does use NDVI, Normalized Differential Vegetation Index, to map productivity. So this works in some systems. For instance, a tropical rainforest being cleared will experience a reduction in productivity, or as measured by NDVI, and then we can pick that up using that reduced productivity. But for arid systems, we need to employ a different approach, and that's why on this slide you can see some of those other data coming in. In particular, those agricultural systems you're referring to, Esteban, we hope we've picked most of them up through the national data on land cover. There's a class there, mapping agriculture, as well as the data on human footprint, which picks up other pressures associated with agriculture, such as people living in the landscape, road networks, nighttime lights, that indicates infrastructure. So we're trying to take a complementary approach, realizing that in some systems, change in productivity will be a good indicator of a negative change, or a reduction in productivity would be a good indicator of degradation. But then in other systems, particularly arid systems, we're relying more on those other inputs, land use and human footprint. And just to reflect, one of our other pilot countries, South Africa, has a very similar challenge, where much of the degradation there is because of eucalyptus plantations and a spread of those eucalyptus, which increases productivity relative to the natural system, but it's one of their main degrading land covers. So a similar challenge in that other arid country. I hope, Esteban, that addresses your question.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Sí, muchas gracias, Oscar.
Thank you so much, Oscar. We also had Alberto, who wanted to complement the answers from the scientific team, and also if you could mention a little bit about the question that we've received with regards to this to the question that has been dropped in the chat box. The proposal of degraded area has included the validation of the land. Yes, when you see an increase in productivity given a determined change in soil, technology will detect it as that, but also as a degradation, because we are using these layers, first of all, to compensate this issue with productivity. So that's how we can set it off. In this case, the declination or decline of productivity will allow us to determine that in structures that have not changed the use, but are increasing, for example, use of chlorophyll. And in the case of this, we'll catch some modifications in areas such as different bushes, or template or moderate tropical forests that have not submitted to change of soil. And we see that what happens in Chile, this is a good proxy, because each of the layers complements each other, and that helps us to have a broader perspective to determine different types of degradation. With regards to the validation of the land, the idea of being able to use a native forest registry, relying on this, that is done through the combination of Asia related to remote perception, but also Rodal scale, that is used through CONAF data. That is another motivation for having changed this into the local data that allows for us to have a closest estimation of land cover, anthropic land cover. Thank you so much, Alberto. Daniel, over to you so that we can move forward with Oscar's presentation. Listening to my colleagues, yes, the direction of the changes at times is not that obvious or poignant as it seems, in the sense that not all cases are aimed at the same direction. For example, vegetation at times that may be more vigorous may give out a sign, for example, vegetation index that may be significant, but this does not necessarily indicate that it's recovering. It may be some invasive species that has a strong impact on the index. That on the one hand. So we need to be careful with regards to the direction in which we have interpreted the changes. I think that we need to be very explicit with regards to how we are measuring that. And the other has to do with a question with regards to protected areas. If this has to do with what we consider degraded areas, could it be that we could include protected areas in these, or are these excluded? And I'm saying this because some protected areas have had some remnants of degradation and that are under that risk, such as, for example, droughts or wildfires. And there's a percentage of degradation. So it is not clear to me that if in those degraded areas, those areas could be within the protected areas or outside of them. That's a question. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Dee, please tell me if we should go to you for the answer or if Oscar will support you in answering the question.
Yeah, so I can answer first, and Oscar could add. Regarding to the protected area, this analysis didn't exclude protected areas. So the restoration area mapped also include the area within the existing protected areas. And that's my answer. So degradation happened within protected area is considered in this analysis. And Oscar, feel free to add.
Nothing to add. Thanks, Dee.
Muchísimas gracias. Y bueno, creo que ya
Thank you so much for that. So I think that with that, we can move forward to Oscar's presentation. That's the scientific lead of the project who will be addressing some different actions under the umbrella of restoration that, of course, implies restoration, rehabilitation, and recovery that can be carried out in Chile. Oscar, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra, and nice to see everybody again. I'm going to have a short presentation now to describe one of the changes that we focused on since we met last, and then we will, through the UN Biodiversity Lab, start to look in a little bit more detail at the resulting restoration map that reflects all the changes that have happened over the last few weeks. So last time we met, I described the overall scientific framework and methodological steps that we undertook to develop the restoration priority map. To respect your time today, I'm not going to go through all of that again, but the resources from our first consultation are available to you if you want to go back and reflect on those. Today, I'm going to focus on a particular post hoc analysis. So by that, I mean an analysis we took on the restoration priority map after it was formed, after we ran the prioritization. And it regards the actual nature of the restoration that might be most suited within that restoration priority map. We've now spent quite a bit of time thinking about what restoration means. And we realize that it doesn't always mean restoring the native ecosystem back to its original condition. That's often what we think about for restoration. But really, that is a very high bar. It can be a difficult thing to achieve in many ecosystems, and it can be a high risk thing in some ecosystems. In some cases, it might be better to take a different approach where you're restoring some elements of the ecosystem or some of its functional capacity or the ecosystem services it provides, but not necessarily trying to replicate exactly what was there before. So we feel that there's 3 basic forms of restoration. We call this to restore an ecosystem to its natural state, to rehabilitate it, potentially to a different state, or to recover it, which means to recover some elements of that ecosystem. But I'll go into those a little bit more detail as I go through. I just wanted to kind of give you an overall framing of where we're going here. Next slide, please. So why might different forms of restoration be more beneficial in some places versus others? So one reason is the level of degradation currently experienced by an ecosystem. Now, some land covers might be hard or even impossible to fully restore to a natural state. They might be more suitable to think about recovering some elements of the ecosystem. So if we think about cities, towns, industrial areas, mining areas, and even croplands, these are really human land covers now. It would be very hard or very costly to try to restore a city to a natural ecosystem. It's even very difficult to restore croplands to a fully natural ecosystem. So in these land covers, full restoration of original ecosystem might be challenging or impossible. Next slide, please. The same can be said for the input data of the human footprint, which has been introduced a little bit already. This is a similar data set to land cover, but can kind of pick up some other forms of degradation that land cover doesn't always pick up, like roads. It can be quite hard to restore a road once it's paved and broadly used for transportation. But the concept here is quite similar, that very high human footprint locations might be hard or impossible to do full restoration. Next slide, please. Climate change, projected future climate change, which we're already seeing some of today, can also influence the form of restoration that might be suitable in a given area. So sorry, I realize these maps are quite small, but if you can try and look at the top left map of Chile, you can see the current distribution of broad biomes within the country. You can see in the north, primarily obviously desert and semi-desert biomes, in the south, forested biomes, both tropical and temperate biomes. And in the center, you could see really a smaller biome of shrublands and shrubby woodland biomes. But now if you drop down one figure to the bottom left figure, this is what the biomes are projected to look like for Chile in about 40, 50 years from now. And you can see one really important change is that within central Chile, the shrublands and the shrubby woodlands biome is projected to increase quite significantly. in particular expanding into areas which are currently forest. So it's projected to go really a biome level shift from forest to shrubby vegetation within central Chile. Now, in those areas projected to go from forest to shrubland, if restoration right now today were to try and regrow a forest, it would cost obviously quite a lot to undergo those tree plantings and preparation of the land for that restoration. And then in the end, climate change might make it impossible for that forest to survive as it transitions instead to shrubland. So restoring the original native ecosystem in some of these places, which are projected to undergo a biome shift, might not be the best strategy. It would be a high-risk strategy. Next slide, please. So I've discussed now some of the aspects that can challenge full ecosystem, original ecosystem restoration. In some of these challenged places, other forms of restoration, in particular rehabilitation and recovery, might be more suitable. And now I'm just going to go through how we define these three different forms of restoration. We can think of them as three different actions for restoration. Next slide, please. Okay, so now as we go forward and when I present to you the final restoration map, it's going to reflect these three terms. The form of restoration that we call restore, we're referring here to ecological restoration, which is to restore the degraded ecosystem to a condition that is similar to the pre-disturbance ecosystem with respect to its species composition, its habitat structure, and its ecosystem functioning. In addition, the resulting ecosystem must be self-sustaining and guarantee the conservation of species. This is the original native species and the ecosystem in general, as well as its goods and ecosystem services. So here, the term restore means really going back to the native system. And it can be viewed as really the highest level of restoration. Next slide, please. Now, the level of restoration below this is what we call rehabilitation. It's to rehabilitate the ecosystem with a focus on repairing its productivity and the ecosystem services in relation to ecosystem function and the structural attributes of the ecosystems. So with rehabilitation, you're trying to bring it to a highly functioning ecosystem, but not necessarily one that looks exactly like the original native one. There might be different species and slightly different structure after rehabilitation. Next slide, please. And then the third and final level of restoration that we consider is ecosystem recovery or ecological recovery. And this is to return the usefulness of the ecosystem for the provision of environmental services other than those of the original ecosystem, integrating it within an ecological landscape and its surroundings. So with recovery, we're not trying to go back to a fully functioning native ecosystem, but really rather one which is more of a mixed use that maybe provides still direct economic benefits, but has more structure and more functioning. So an example here might be an agricultural system, which where recovery actions maybe plant trees within that landscape to enhance the habitat structure and the carbon storage, soil carbon, while still having the food production values. So here we're thinking from the highest level of restoring the full native ecosystem to the next level, rehabilitating the functioning and ecosystem services versus recovering some elements of those services. So for the post hoc analysis, next slide, please. We took the resulting restoration priority map And we analyzed using a number of data sets that you've already been presented and should be familiar with. We did post hoc analysis to try and break out within this restoration map for Chile, where would be the most suitable places to restore an ecosystem versus rehabilitate versus recover. So first, within the priority map, places that are suitable for full restoration were places that had a lower human footprint value. So this is the lowest 50% within Chile, and that they were not fully converted to agricultural or urban landscapes, and they were projected to be climatically stable. They weren't projected to change biomes. So this, because it's going to stay the same biome, it can be restored to its native state, and it's not so degraded that that full restoration is impossible. So these places we map as suitable or candidate for actual full restoration. Next slide. So in terms of rehabilitating the ecosystem, so this is still quite a high level of restoration, but it's not necessarily to a native state. So rehabilitation we mapped as places, again, that were not fully converted. They weren't an urban city, they weren't agriculture, and therefore they could potentially be rehabilitated, but they were projected to undergo a climate-induced biome shift. So for instance, those places that were projected to go from forest to shrubland, if they we consider these as candidates for rehabilitation if they weren't fully converted. I'm going to have a discussion time at the end, so if we want to revisit any of these concepts, we're happy to. But next slide, please, present the final form of restoration, which is ecosystem recovery. So these were places basically that were highly modified, very high human footprint, or a fully human land cover, where we recognize that really restoring it to a fully functional ecosystem probably isn't possible. And in this case, we didn't worry about climate change because we're not trying to reform an entire ecosystem here. We're just trying to bring in functional elements of this ecosystem, maybe native or some natural processes for water cycling or enhancing carbon through tree planting, these sorts of actions where we're not trying to reform a full ecosystem. So that final category is places that are highly modified, and we're not worried about the climate projected biome shift. Okay, so this element of the analysis is I'm guessing fully new, at least in terms of what we're presenting, but maybe some of you have faced these considerations in your work, that there are different forms of restoration, and depending on current land cover and projected climate change, one form might be more suitable than another. So before I show you the resulting map that breaks out and parses these different forms of restoration across Chile within the priority map, happy to have any further discussion about these forms of restoration.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Entonces, si hubiera alguna pregunta.
Thank you so much, Oscar. If there are any questions just before we look into the restoration map, the resulting restoration map for Chile. Claudio, yes. Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you, Oscar, for your presentation. We cannot hear you, Claudio, and I'm mentioning this precisely because of the interpreters. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, can you hear me a little bit better? Yes, much better. Thank you, Claudio. Thank you, Cassandra. So I would like to thank Oscar for his presentation. And also thank you to all former speakers. My question has to do with regards to these concepts and it has to do with regards to rehabilitation. I'm not sure if Oscar mentioned that, but we are aiming at recovering the same ecosystemic services that have been lost, but considering other species, for example, in the case of this biome has changed due to climate change, or can we look for other ecosystemic systems different from the original ones?
That's a really good question, Claudio. I'm not sure if I've grappled with that level of detail. The general concept is what you're discussing, where it's a focus on service, not species composition. However, to be honest, I haven't considered, is it the exact same services as were naturally there? Or is it just a higher level of services, though it might be different forms of services? So I can't give you really an expert opinion there. All I can give you is my initial thought, which is that rehabilitation would reflect potentially a change in the form of services. We can think about the most important case here for Chile, which is that some of the areas, many of the central areas, are projected to move from a forested ecosystem to a more of a shrubby vegetation ecosystem. If rehabilitation in those ecosystems were to recognize this and therefore try and recover ecosystem services toward a shrub ecosystem, which can have very high biodiversity, but it will not have as high of a level of biomass carbon, living vegetation carbon. So I would think that a rehabilitation strategy within central Chile, accounting for climate change, would involve a shift in the forms of ecosystem services. For instance, away from biomass carbon storage toward biodiversity conservation. Potentially there are other elements here like soil retention within shrublands and maybe soil carbon deposition and potentially the water benefits as well.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Te escuchamos,
Thank
Daniel.
you so much, Oscar. Daniel, take it away. Thank you. With regards to these terms of restoration or rehabilitation, I think it's good to make these distinctions, but I think we need to be cautious not to mention actions triggered or derived from them, but rather make the distinction that is, these are different situations. Rehabilitation, these are areas where biomes would change. That is a definition that suggests that someone could not restore to original reference ecosystem, but I think we should not be mentioning specific areas, action, sorry. That is, we will suggest certain specific lines of actions. Since the biome will change, then we need to anticipate that and maybe suggest that certain species should be there. And I'm saying this for these actions to be taken at the scale that they should, because there's a very fine line there, very fine analysis there. And also because with regards to the selection or the emphasis that we may place on that, quote, rehabilitation, unquote, end quote, I think that we need to carry out an analysis of a different level. So we do know that there are certain trends that show vegetation, for example, on having difficulty on regenerating in the typical forest. This is an element that has come up at some meetings, but if we really want to implement or carry out actions, I would say that the analysis of those actions should be seen in the context. And since this is a national generic assessment, we need to make the distinction of the categories, the 3 different categories. That's great, but we should stay at that to avoid triggering other interpretations that may be at a different level or scale. Thank you so much, Daniel. That is rather a comment, not really a question. Is there any reaction to that, Oscar, that you want to share?
No, I think that's a great point. So I did use the word action in my presentation, I recall. But I think based on Danielle's reflection there, maybe the way to think about these categories is more the objective of restoration. What is the objective? Is it a recovery back to the reference system versus a rehabilitation of function, or sorry, a restoration to the original system, or is it a rehabilitation of function, or is it a recovery of some elements? So being objective focused, this is a national level analysis. You cannot send boots on the ground with shovels based only on the mapping we've done. It's going to require much more detailed analysis and community engagement to really identify the actual actions needed in each location.
Muchísimas gracias, Oscar.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Thank you for your comments. Maybe we can take 10-minute break, and then we can come back to focus on the map for restoration priority map, and maybe connect that to the feedback exercise, where we have as a first question, what is missing, what we can still enhance or improve, and that we will be able to guide along with the scientific team. So let us come back in 10 minutes. We'll have a 10-minute break, and please stay with us. We have the feedback session soon. Thank you.
3, 2, 1. Ahí está el conteo regresivo. Hacemos como en el teatro entonces. Estoy escuchando en inglés. Sí, hacemos como en el teatro. Primera llamada, segunda llamada. Ahí veo a Esteban. Muy bien.
So we're back. Oscar, everyone is here. I want to see some thumbs up. I want to know that you're here. Carmen is here, Dee is here. We're back. It's necessary to have some coffee and water to start this feedback session. Monica, my colleague, is going to share with you in the chat the link to the Jamboard in which we're going to carry out a feedback exercise. And this is going to be interesting. Oscar, when you share the restoration map, the colleagues may have the link to Jamboard at hand so that while you hear, maybe an idea comes to your mind, or maybe you think that something is necessary, put that in the Jamboard to make this session more dynamic and interactive. Just 1 second, Oscar, to show our folks how to use the Jamboard, and then I will immediately give you back the floor to share the restoration map. So I have shared the link to Jamboard. Monica has shared the link to Jamboard, and Monica is going to share the screen quickly for a second to show you how to use the Jamboard and write your thoughts there while you hear Oscar to make those notes. So let's show you for a second how the Jamboard works. This is what we do in when we are on site, when we use the post-its and stick them in a board. You will see the map and you will write in the Jamboard what's useful, what you think is missing. And Oscar is going to explain in detail this map. And while you hear Oscar, you'll have this link open, and then we will take some minutes to answer questions. This is the first question. And then the second question would be the following, and has to do with the application and uses of the priority restoration map. And the last one has to do with the key actors and stakeholders to be involved in the next steps. So with that, please have the link at hand, and we'll delve into this exercise after Oscar's remarks. Oscar, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra. Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take a look at the map. Okay, I think everybody can see now. What I'm showing you here is a live link to the data through the United Nations Biodiversity Lab. I think at the end, after the feedback session, Dijiang will be showing you a little bit more about the UN Biodiversity Lab and the platform. So I'm not going to talk much about that. I'm going to focus here on the resulting map. So I have all the layers loaded here. And the first layer I'm really showing you is the restoration priority map for the global target of achieving 30% protection of degraded lands within Chile. But we also have a second version of the map, which is achieving the national target, which is an increase in restoration activities of 1 million hectares by 2030. This is in addition to the, I believe, about 2.6% of Chile, which is currently receiving restoration actions. So here we're looking at the full country, but as we move, I'll zoom into different places, and anybody who would like to, please ask me through the interpreter or in the chat to zoom in anywhere you would like to see. Obviously, after this live session, we'll be sharing the data with the national team, and these data will be available to be integrated with other GIS platforms for closer inspection and further analyses. This is just kind of a first reveal and taking a look at the data. So let's not worry about the colors yet. The colors break out the different restoration objectives: restore, rehabilitate, recover. So I'm going to focus first on the global map. you could see here that a lot of the restoration priority map is within central Chile. Really, I would guess shouldering the majority of the burden for achieving that, the 30% global target. Central Chile is being really identified as a key priority. But there are also areas in the north being identified here. And moving south, this looks like a very important area. And there are some areas down in Tierra del Fuego as well. So that's the overall distribution of the map. This is the more ambitious global target. But we've also run a scenario with the national target. What's quite interesting is that the national target is fully nested within the global target. So achieving that 1 million hectares, it's captured within this broader map. And really the way to look at it, I would think, is they are the highest priority areas. The first place is to be assessed through further analyses, community engagement, and in the field inspection for actual restoration. So here I'm going to click off the global target and focus on the priority map now for the national target. And you'll see, so here I'm going to click off the global. Now this is the 1 million hectares plus the existing restoration areas being mapped now. So these can be viewed as the highest priority areas. I'm just going to click off the other global actions as well. So this is the second version of the map, the second scenario focused on the national target. You can see the distribution is largely the same, where central Chile is again being identified as the highest priority, the most amount of area as priority for restoration, but still this critical location in the far north, and this location in the south. But some of the places in Tierra del Fuego now no longer show up as a priority for achieving the national target. And now I'm just going to show you the nesting. I'm now going to click on, I'm going to click, now I'm back to the global target, and I'm going to click on the national, on and off the national layer. And you can see nothing changes. And that means when you look at these two scenarios, the national target is fully captured within the global target. And again, like I mentioned, though, I think the way to look at this is that the global target should be, the priority areas identified for the global target should be thought of as the highest priority locations. So I'm going to pause for a minute to ask people if they'd like me to zoom into different parts of the map, but there's one thing I want to present first, and that is the Danielle, do you want to interject now, which I'm happy with, or do you want to wait a few more minutes?
No hay problema, puedo esperar unos minutos.
No problem, I can wait for a couple of minutes.
Okay. So the next thing I just want to show is the different colors represent the different forms of, or different objectives of restoration. So I'm going to get rid of the global target. And now we're looking at, these are the priorities for the national target, and I'll put them on one at a time. So first is these places in teal or blue are being identified for the objective of fully restoring the natural ecosystem, because they are not fully converted to a human land use, and they're projected to be climatically stable at the biome level. So it appears that these are mostly forested with some shrubland locations. They are projected to stay as that same biome, so they could be considered as candidates for full ecosystem restoration. The next, I'm going to load, I'm not sure if there's no locations. Oh yeah, sorry, just took a little minute to load. So these areas now in purple are places being identified for rehabilitation because they are not fully converted. However, they are projected to go a level of climate change that could flip the biome from one biome type to another. Most likely, I don't have the underlying data here, but most likely they're being projected to move from a forested ecosystem to a biome to a shrubby woodland biome. And then the final color, yellow, these are areas that are being identified as for recovery of some elements of function and or species composition. They're being identified for this recovery because they are highly modified. Now, the most really the important thing here is when we zoom back out, we see that the majority of our restoration priority map, when we take these three colors, put them together, that's our overall restoration map. The majority of these areas are yellow, meaning that the majority are being identified for the objective of ecosystem recovery, not full restoration or rehabilitation. And the reason is that the areas in our priority map are largely converted to human land uses or have very high human footprint. So something I would suggest if we're going to do further analyses might be to look at that and discuss that threshold of what we're considering as too converted for restoration or rehabilitation and maybe more suitable for recovery, because recovery right now is dominating, which means that this analysis is recommending most places be considered for things like planting trees within human land uses, not fully restoring the human land uses. Okay, I think that's kind of the overview I wanted to get from the map. So I'm now happy to turn it over to you, Danielle, and I think Claudio, you might have had questions as well. I'm happy to navigate around this map and look at any areas you'd like.
Gracias, Oscar. Te escuchamos,
Thank
Daniel.
you, Oscar. We're going to hear you. Daniel, Claudia has raised the hand, and it's necessary to identify what we can improve, what's missing. That's what we're using the Jamboard, and precisely we're taking notes about what you're saying. Daniel, yes. Thank you, Oscar. It is interesting to see these maps and having these two approaches, the national approach and the global approach. I think it's very important for us to understand when we speak about the global approach, you are referring to what aspects of the global perspective? Is this referring to this 30% global goal, the global goal? So what's the meaning of this spatial representation of this that you are sharing with us in terms of surface, that 30% that we are seeing visually? What does this 30% represent in terms of the total area? Is it total area of the country? What does this 30% represent in quantitative terms? That's a question from me. And what is said as a priority from a national perspective, comparing to what is defined from the global perspective, it seems that the national set of priorities is reduced when compared to the global, because it's contained in the global. So my question that we have here is that we sort of have a hypothesis. In the zone of the Mediterranean zone, where we see the higher degradation footprint, we think the priority should be there in general terms. And the results compare certain hypotheses. We also see areas in the higher part and others away from the center. So it means that the focus of the efforts of restoration that we have conducting in the last years have been focused on the central zone, and it is a coincidence with the higher footprint detected. That's what I'm able to see. So this is a comment, what I'm saying. But it's good for me to understand how we see this global approach landed or reflected in our national perspective, and what is the difference between the priority set at the national level and the priority set at the global level. What is the most significant quantitative difference that you can identify?
Okay, thank you, Danielle. I'm going to talk. If I don't properly address your questions, we can loop through again. So yeah, I think you've hit on the difference between the global and the national scenarios that we're presenting here. Everything's the same in terms of the degradation mapping, the benefits of restoration mapping, all those planning features. The only change we make is to what we call the area-based target. How much of Chile needs to be restored to achieve the target? The global target is from the Global Biodiversity Framework of restoring 30% of degraded areas. So it's not 30% of Chile overall. It's once you've done your degradation mapping, that's one reason why the degradation mapping is so important. Once you've mapped the degraded areas, the global target under the Global Biodiversity Framework is to restore 30% of those degraded areas. So in the case of Chile, after the degradation mapping, I believe that results in a national target of about 11.5% of Chile's land area. So when I click on this is now the priority map for achieving the global target, all the colored areas you can see here cover a total of about 11.5% of Chile. Whereas the national target is to restore 1 million hectares additional by 2030. So it's additional to the areas which are mapped already as receiving restoration. When you combine those areas, the total national coverage under the national policy is about 4% of Chile. So when I take off the global layers and go back to the national priority map, all these colors add up to about 4% of the country. They do spatially, they fully support each other because they're both trying to optimize the same benefits. The national map is fully nested within the global map. So the global map is not using global data or a global approach. It's still a national approach, national data, but it's a more ambitious area-based target under the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, why central? Why the Mediterranean regions in Chile? There's two reasons. The first is the degradation mapping. If you remember the map, so many maps, you probably don't remember the particular one, but the degradation map that Scott led, it maps central Chile, the Mediterranean ecoregions, as being most degraded. So restoration can only occur in degraded areas. So many of those areas are within central Chile. The other reason, though, is we didn't show you these maps this time. We showed them before, is the benefits of restoration. I can't remember how many there is. It's about a dozen different national data sets that are being used to map the water benefits, the biodiversity benefits, other ecosystem service, carbon benefits. Many of those maps identify the Mediterranean ecosystems as being very important as well. So I believe it's a combination between which areas have been degraded and which areas would benefit the most, lead to the greatest benefits from restoration that are leading to central Chile being identified as such a high priority. One more factor, though, is if we go back to the national map, the national data that maps existing restoration within Chile maps a lot of those efforts within central Chile. So actually, the slight majority of this map is based on existing action being taken in Chile. And much of that existing action already is within central Chile. Then we're building that extra 1 million hectares is further identifying central Chile. So I think there's a lot of reasons why it's focusing here. I'm not sure if I've covered the full breadth there, Danielle, of your questions.
Sí, en el sentido que
Yes, with regards to the fact that I understand the national and global rather than methodological difference is that of scope. And ultimately, what's national? It's the million hectares or the identification of that million hectares will cover a part of what is 30% that amounts to global. So that 4%, if I understood correctly, that's 1 million hectares, as you said. And think that the global percentage would be around 11%. So that contribution of 1 million hectares with regards to the global target, it's almost half of the effort that we should be, or that we should expect to do, or that we should be making. Thank you, Oscar. It's quite clear now. Thank you, Daniel. And also, I saw Claudio's hand raised at one point. I'm not sure if you still want to intervene. Please feel free to do so. Thank you, Cassandra. Truth is, as when I raised my hand, I was actually going to ask what Oscar actually showed, which was these surfaces, these areas with different colors, see how they were distributed in the national surface, because effectively we saw that they had different descriptions with regards to what we'll understand in restoration, even as of the also the chat where we see some recommendations. And although this is the information that we handle, what's most recommended in for these territories, because it would promote an ecological restoration. But of course, we will need to invest all the more resources in order to keep that original biome in those areas that are highlighted in yellow for recovery. So I understand that complemented what I once wrote in the chat box. So I indeed am a little bit surprised, although as Daniel says, these areas are well related to urban nuclei and very highly intervened areas. So it's interesting to see that the recovery surface is extremely high when we come to compare it with the other two activities, especially with that when we compare it to that of ecological restoration. And at times we talk about restoration and we have that idea in mind that go back to original ecosystems, but we see that recommendations aim or push us to look for other types of restoration, not always aiming at the original ecosystem recovery. So I think it's very interesting what you've been able to show. Thank you, Claudio. I just want to mention that this last thing that you add could well be added to the second slide of Jamboard, where you have use of the map for restoration priorities. Maybe you could help us and put it in a sticky note in the Jamboard. Claudia, over to you. Hi. I have a couple of doubts with regards to the definitions of each of the different types of restoration, since I think their recommendations are a little bit mixed up. Finally, this priority map, to the best of my understanding, includes, or each of these different type includes a series of recommendations recommended for each of the areas. I'm not quite sure I understand it as a prioritization, but as for prioritization, I would also understand the prioritization of the efforts that we would be allocating to each of the areas. For example, to understand that the light blue areas for restoration would be areas that will call for a lower level of effort and in some way could maybe root for a natural restoration where we would initially need less effort to get to that ecosystem level, and also thinking that it's more looking at because it resembles the original ecosystem as opposed to the areas in yellow that would call for higher levels of effort because they are highly degraded. So I think there is also a confusion that lies there that I think Danielle brought up earlier on around these definitions and how these definitions are rather a set of recommendations of certain actions for certain areas, but because clearly every project of restoration will be analyzed vis-a-vis the reference ecosystem aimed at and as of the particular features specific to each site, but prioritization would rather say what to do with regards to efforts, resources we need to invest in each of the areas. And I therefore think that this does not provide that type of signals that is also highly prioritized and needed at a national level.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm happy to address your comments. Unless Danielle, did you have your hand up for different comments or to discuss with Claudia?
No, es que me parece que este es un punto bien importante
I
porque
think that this is a very important aspect because ultimately these categories, whether we like it or not, although these are generic, in some way convey a message. And I think that that message,
pienso que hay que ver qué es lo que se dice.
well, we need to think about what we say because we may be sending out a generic signal or sign that taken to a specific territory may not be really landed. Now, what Claudia has just said makes a little bit sense in the following regard. In an ideal way, we are seeking to go back to the reference ecosystem. Now, there's a magnitude of effort to achieve this that will depend on the situation in which the territory lies. But I think that the decision to go for a specific option for a restoration more onto reference ecosystem or rehabilitation or recovery is a discussion that calls for a different level because otherwise you are setting a trend because it could be that stakeholders may want to go in that direction, although efforts may be really high, and stakeholders may still decide to go towards closer to a reference ecosystem landscape. What it must be clear is the magnitude of effort that it'll convey or that it'll call for. And if they choose to do that, well, it's good. And of course, it's good to know that going for that option in certain territories will be much more complex and more difficult to attain and would definitely call for more efforts. But I think that rephrasing that in terms of the efforts that every scenario would convey, I think that leaves the decision onto the stakeholders. But of course, they would be making this decision informed of the level of effort they need to exert. The other already sets forth a type of partition with regards to the decision-making process, I'd say. So I wouldn't recommend this to go for to be a generic level discussion. Thank you, Oscar. Let us listen to you before we give the floor to Esteban and Claudia.
I think that's really useful feedback. And I think we'll probably need further discussion about how to change these categories then. What I'm hearing is that a particular recovery, now these are the ecosystems that have undergone, that are currently highly modified, that that communities or other decision makers on the ground might still choose to go for a high effort restoration, even though it's currently agriculture. I do think that the climate change still might influence what's possible there. Is that in that highly modified landscape, is it projected to be climatically stable? Then it's still possible to do with a high effort ecosystem restoration to the reference ecosystem. But if it's projected to really change climatically, even with a high effort, we're probably still talking about rehabilitation. So I don't know if we can do it in this form or if we need to follow up, but we might either change the description of recovery to reflect it's about effort. The options are still open what you do there, but it's going to require a lot of effort if you choose restoration or rehabilitation. Or we could create 4 categories and break up the recovery category into high effort rehabilitation in places that are going to change climatically, or high effort ecosystem restoration in places that will be climatically stable. Those are just my original thoughts. I'm hearing what you're saying is that we don't want to constrain options with this national mapping that might not reflect what people really want to do. And I'm not sure, Cassandra, what's the best forum? It seems we're moving here to really good discussion where we're getting feedback. I know that the session was set up to bring that feedback in through the Jamboard. I don't think we need to do the mapping anymore. It seems like we're doing discussion and feedback. So I'm not sure if you want to change, get me to stop sharing and make sure we get this feedback down properly.
De acuerdo, sí, totalmente de acuerdo. Estamos avanzando, igual.
Absolutely, we're moving forward. And of course, keep your hands raised. But if Monica can share her screen, we are already gathering a lot of your contributions on Jamboard. Many have actually noted this directly. We have question 1, Oscar, as you said, we've collected a lot of this feedback as we move forward in the discussion, so we can continue listening and we can note down if necessary, if there's anything to improve, what they have pointed out as useful. Remember that, Monica, please help me out showing if you move on to the next question you have with regards to applications and uses of the restoration priority map, and lastly, what key actors and stakeholders are crucial to involve in the upcoming steps. So we are taking down note, Oscar, of all of what has been said, and I think that it's quite rich to have the exercise on par of the access to the map for you to show. What I must say is that we are a little bit delayed with regards to time. So I'm going to give the floor to Esteban and Claudio. I'm not sure who raised a hand earlier on. So who would like to go first? I think Claudio, and later on Esteban. Thank you, Cassandra. I would also like to say that we also need to be careful that this is a national scale, that we use templates or databases on a geographic information that is quite square and that will take us to cover certain activities based on the criteria that have been defined and that Oscar showed. So, of course, so we need to understand that these the images in yellow are sites that have been very much intervened because it has a high human footprint, and of course the recommendation aims at a recovery as of the level of degradation that we will find in the territory. This is what I've also added on the lower right end of the Jamboard. It's important to understand that since the human footprint is really relevant when it talk about degraded areas, when it comes to prioritizing based on this million hectares or 30% of this area surface, of course, factors of degradation that may be included, for example, in native forests, that are areas that are less intervened by humans, most likely will be lagging with regards to that prioritization. And this leads you, of course, to having a map covered in yellow rather than in light blue. So there's an element to revise there or review and ultimately revised by the team. We can identify other layers that may allow for example, urban areas where the action level may be much more difficult or limited. You can also move forward with a prioritization that may be farther away from urban areas. Yes, Oscar, I can hear you. I'm not sure if there's any reaction. Otherwise, I can give the floor to Esteban. Please let me know.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just didn't want to dominate the discussion, but I will.
Okay.
Since you called on me, I'll give a reflection to Claudio. The nice thing is the prioritization and the spatial work we've done here is kind of two-phased. The first phase did not consider these different objectives, restore, rehabilitate, recover. It just considered degradation and then all the benefits that could occur from restoration, and then the national and the global target. And then we ran, a pretty complicated systematic conservation planning software to identify the priorities, and that created the priority map you can see here. Really what we've been discussing now is the breaking out with these different objectives. That is done in a post hoc GIS analysis. And I think what I'm hearing from you, Claudio, is, well, we really need to dig deeper here. We need to bring in some other elements and play with the thresholds and see what it tells us. The nice thing is we don't have to open the can of worms for the full optimization. This can be done. We take the priority map. This can be done quite simply in GIS. So I think that's a great idea. We did our best crack at it in the last few weeks, but really I would envision further analysis like you describe. And the good thing is those are very accessible GIS analyses.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Te escuchamos, Esteban, y con esto.
Thank you, Oscar. We're going to give the floor to Esteban, and with this, we're going to be closing the exercise for the last presentation today. We hear you, Esteban. Thank you, Cassandra. It was quite interesting, this reflection from those who have intervened and the responses provided by Oscar. Clearly, there is an important concern regarding the scope of the priority that the map can reflect. So I also think that beyond speaking about a map of priorities, we should speak about a map of recommendation of priorities or suggestions, more than suggestion, recommendations, I would say, because the map, even if it's multidimensional from the point of view of the inputs that have been used for its development, there are some layers that are not able to reflect some important dimensions that have to do with the exercise of the setting priorities from the point of view of public policy in line what was mentioned by Daniel and Claudio, I think, and Claudia as well. So I think that's very important. And there are other dimensions, and I was thinking about Elsa, some of the layers that we also deemed important in that exercise that are also relevant. For example, everything that has to do with the presence of indigenous communities, local communities, those elements as well are part of, for example, the ownership of land also is relevant. The different of efforts that have to do with the developing restoration initiatives in um, privately owned lands and publicly owned land. Some dimensions are not collected by the map and that are relevant when it comes to setting priorities in terms of restoration efforts. So the big potential of the map is to show us areas that are from the biophysical point of view and other points of view that are highly relevant to precisely um, have these reflections within the framework of public policy. And the other thing has to do with a more technical nature. And briefly, I would like to mention it would be good to think about the polygons form and the spatial resolution of the analysis, because there were some 250 meters reflection resolution, but we didn't speak about the resolution of the uh, output exercise, the minimum unit that is being mapped, and we were seeing the list there. We saw a sort of fragmentation of several pixels, and it would be maybe convenient to indicate there what's the minimum in unit that is being mapped as part of the output. And if it's possible, where these minimum units are so atomized or spatially fragmented, could we could apply maybe an algorithm that will enable us to unite them in order to reflect an aerial condition that is more interesting from the point of view of updating public policy. Otherwise, it's like powdering too much this scenario, this mapping scenario. Thank you, Esteban. Oscar, can we hear Daniel as a last intervention? And with that, you can make a final closing reflection of this exercise to hear our last presentation and finish for today. So, Daniel, the floor is yours. Briefly, with regard to what was said, and there was a reflection on what this map highlights the most before discriminating between restoration, recovery, and other elements. It is important to understand what can be done from the national scale point of view. For me, it is interesting to see how can certain territories or areas are generated as areas of interest for restoration that in reality in some cases are show a combination of different situations. So you could have an area that is there for restoration or recovery, and that notion of areas of interest or territories of interest more there appearing in certain areas. For us, and for me particularly, it's quite interesting to see this because you have this in the national policy for the restoration of landscapes in our country. And the reason to follow these logics based on landscapes is precisely it's because it's difficult to consider only one situation, especially with the geography like the one we have in Chile that is so complex. So we have different types of typologies, and several different efforts are required in a same area because you have several dimensions there. So approaching these areas implies seeing new elements. You see zones that might become interesting, and as Esteban said, it's necessary to apply certain filters to choose with more clarity areas for intervention. So beyond targeting specific goals that are like subsets of these areas. This is my comment, and this perfectly fits with the policy, national policy in this regard, and the efforts conducted. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. So we're going to hear you again, Oscar, for a final reflection on this exercise.
Just a very general observation. When we mapped essential life support areas across 12 countries around the world, our experience, the global team's experience working with Chile is you took more leadership than any other country we saw in terms of shaping the analysis and interpreting the results for those ELSA efforts. Really, I'm seeing the same year for this Restoring Hope work. This discussion has been very rich, highly informed. So it's been a pleasure to undertake this work and participate in this session. Just some specific reflections on the last comments by Esteban and Danielle is I think a lot of what we're talking about here reflects the scale. Some of our earlier discussions here, we started talking down in scale to finer resolutions, the fact that some individual communities might want to undertake certain actions, even though the national mapping might not reflect that. And then now, Esteban and Danielle, your comments are, kind of almost coming up in scale there in terms of, the need to identify these broad areas, regions of priorities, and the value in this mapping without needing to go to the precision of restoration versus rehabilitation, that really it also paints a larger picture. So really when we undertake an analysis like this, we can do the best we can, but we'll never be able to cover the full breadth of scales. So always an effort like this will contribute to other efforts, political discussions, other core scale analyses, community engagement, detailed mapping, maybe using LiDAR. So I think we're probably striking a good balance. If in this discussion we've talked about applications at finer resolution as well as applications at coarser resolution, we're probably striking a good balance with this national scale mapping. The one final thing is the detailed Esteban. That's a nice point. We do have algorithms to increase the cohesion of the mapping. We haven't applied them, but we can apply that so we don't have this salt and pepper individual areas, but rather more cohesive areas that make more sense for undergoing programs.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Sí, incluso en el Jamboard.
Thank you, Oscar. In Jamboard, some people have said that it's interesting, the idea of improving this area of boundaries in the map, the contingencies that may appear. In that regard, I'm going to ask you to give us some additional 10 minutes since we started 10 minutes to start for the rest of our people to connect. We're going to have a last presentation that is very important about access to the biodiversity lab. We thank you for your great participation on what is in the Jamboard, but the whole session is going to be processed to create a report to reflect all of your feedback. So we are going to hear the Zan expert UNDP program, and Dee is going to explain further about this tool. In particular, how can you access data, world data and national data, even you can use this to have a more efficient decision-making process, climate change, sustainable development efforts. And we are very happy to share with you that recently the Restoration Connection has been developed, and we have a private space of work for Chile. As you saw, is the platform that has been used by Oscar to show you this map of restoration. Sorry if we need to speed up, but it's very important for everyone to be familiar with this platform. Dee, you have the floor.
Thank you, Cassandra. Now let me share my screen. Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Dee. So in the project, besides the restoration dossier, the PDF format of the report, we also provide you an interactive map platform to view and download these special maps online. And that's the same platform Oscar was using to present the result maps. It's called UN Biodiversity Lab. So next, I will briefly introduce this platform to help you get started to navigate these spatial data. Let's start with basic. What is UN Biodiversity Lab? The UN Biodiversity Lab is a UN level free and open source platform with many of the best available global spatial data sets in biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development. It doesn't require GIS expertise or technical skill to use, and we created this platform to support policymakers and countries all over the world with the resource to access spatial data and use them to strengthen their capacity in conservation and sustainable development. The initial version of UNBL was created 5 years ago, specifically to support parties in their commitments to the CBD. We have a long tradition in supporting CBD, and now with a focus on the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework. Our goal is to continue provide resources that can be adapted to the national context and support countries based on their existing capacity needs. Due to a limit of time, I will skip the trailer of this platform, but I will share with you the link in the chat later. So there are 6 main features on UNBL, including access to the global data to calculate dynamic metrics and to use the workspace function to upload your own data and manage your own maps. Also, later next year, you can actually run the prioritization analysis on UNBL to create a map similar like the restoration map, but you can decide and customize the weights and the parameters on the platform in real time. And so next, I will highlight features that are relevant to ecosystem restoration project. Start with the global data. Currently, there are over 400 global data layers on biodiversity, carbon, and sustainable development. More than 70% of these data are totally open access, means you can freely use and download these data on the UNBL platform. And when you click on any country in the places tab, the map view will automatically zoom in to this country and calculate 8 dynamic metrics based on global indicators on biodiversity intactness, carbon density, vegetation index, land cover, monthly fire, etc., and human footprint, like the human footprint index we used in the degradation mapping. And to view these data, you can load them to the map. You can also download these statistics as a Excel format for your further analysis. And for the global data related to ecosystem restoration, we recently launched a restoration data collection. This collection provides key resources for planners and decision makers to identify restoration needs and where to take actions. Here we categorized restoration into 3 distinct types depending on the objective of the restored ecosystems. This include to restore degraded natural area to more intact natural ecosystem, to improve ecosystem service of degraded modified ecosystem, as well as restore modified ecosystem to natural state, similar like the differentiation of recover, rehabilitate, and restore Oscar just introduced. And these collection has gathered the global data sets on restoration, such as nature map data on areas of global significance for restoration, the Forest Landscape Integrity Index, as well as the World Atlas of Desertification. To view this collection, you can scroll down to the homepage of UNBL and find the Discover section. There are 3 different data collections already, and you can click on the link to load the restoration collection. Then for all the national level data we used in this restoration project, they can be viewed and managed through secure workspace. The UNBL workspace is a security environment for countries and stakeholders to upload and manage their own data. And you can upload any places to calculate the same dynamic metrics I just showed earlier, or you can upload any raster or spatial data layers and overlap and view them alongside the global data. In this project, we have already built a workspace for Chile, and as Oscar just presented, the restoration priority map as well as the other input layers are already uploaded to this workspace. And you can also find the degraded areas mapped and some previous data resource on ELSA Chile, and then you can load them together and make comparison or conduct further analysis. And when you load the data you need, you can also easily create and style your own maps on UNBL and use them for reports, studies, or communication products. And that's the key information I would like to share. If you want to join the Chile workspace to view and download all these spatial data or create maps, there are 2 easy steps to engage. First, you can register an account with UNBL, and then you can contact us, me and Daniel, who's the current administrator of this workspace, to add your account into the workspace as a member. And then you can explore these spatial layer in an interactive way and also explore the global data resource on UNBL. With that, I will say thank you. I hope it's helpful. Happy to take any questions. Back to you, Cassandra.
Muchas gracias, Di. Sí, muchas gracias. Entonces,
Thank you, Dee. Daniel, in just a few seconds, we will close. I don't want to take additional time from you because it's lunchtime in Chile. Daniel, briefly, with Esteban, we're going to meet this upcoming Monday regarding this topic. So I would like to see if we can include you in a meeting we want to organize with the people here that are interested, and have a in detail conversation. Just that. Of course, of course. And any one of you who would like to be part of that is welcome. Yes, Esteban, we can coordinate precisely to participate in this meeting, and you are all invited to be part of this private workspace. With this, we're coming to the end of this second consultation session. Let's give a round of applause, at least use the reactions that are available here in Zoom. And this applause is well deserved. Sorry if we had to speed up at the end, but this is the evidence of a fruitful dialogue we have held today. With this, as next steps, we'll be sharing weeks a final version of the restoration dossier that is going to include this last contribution if it's necessary. During these weeks, we're going to have individual one-on-one dialogue with the support of Alberto Analysis, the national consultant in Chile, with the UNDP in Chile, and with the close coordination between the Ministry of Environment and other institutions. We're going to share with you a report related to this consultation mechanism as we did the first time. Thank you for your participation. And now I personally want to thank you, all of those who have made this possible. First, the Office of the UNDP in Chile. Thank you very much, Esteban, who has guided us and made significant contributions for the implementation of this project. I wanted to thank as well Daniel Alvarez, Carolina Barra, and Constanza Tropa from the Ministry of Environment of Chile. Also to our colleagues from the CONAF who are here with us. We have Claudio Brenner. Let me know if I have forgotten to mention any of the colleagues who have joined us here today. We wanted to thank Paloma Terrazos, Officer of Environment and Energy from the UNDP Chile, and Georgina Braga, the current representative of Chile to the UNDP for her support to this project. We want to thank as well to Jameson Irvinson for creating this vision and inspiring us for this project that can help Chile along with the global team that is here with us. We have had as well Enrique Paniagua, Monica Mora, who are here helping us and making this possible. Marion Marigo, Veronica Recondo as well. I wanted to thank as well Oscar Vente, Scott Atkinson, Dizan, all of our experts in geospatial data who have led and who lead this methodology that is very scientifically rigorous to make this possible. Alberto Alanis, our national expert, who's an expert in geospatial data. This would not be possible without his support. It's very important the coordination with national experts. We wanted to thank Flor and Carmelo, who must hate me because I'm speaking so fast at the end of this session. But thank you for your great support and work. And especially thank you. Thanks everyone for your participation. And all of this will be collected and reflected in the last version of this dossier that we're going to update and that we hope is useful for the priorities of restoration in Chile. With that, we have come to an end to this session of this project, Restoring Hope in Chile. Thank you very much and see you soon. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos y todas.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.